The ice lens was 3 inches from Jakob Weatherby's face when the whiteout swallowed him whole. One moment he could see the dark line of pines marking the route back to his cabin. The next moment, the world became uniform. White chaos, wind-driven snow erasing every landmark, every shadow, every reference point that separated Earth from sky. He stood motionless in waist-deep powder, knowing that men died this way in the Montana wilderness, not from bear attacks or gunshot wounds, but from walking in circles until hypothermia shut down their minds within shouting distance of safety. The device hanging from his pack strap was untested in conditions this severe, built from materials other mountain men mocked as useless, designed using principles he barely understood but had spent 6 months obsessing over since his partner Thomas froze to death, doing exactly what Jakob was doing now. Before we dive into how one trapper's grief transformed into an invention that saved lives across the northern Rockies, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever experienced true whiteout conditions. And if stories of frontier ingenuity and impossible survival move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable innovation from the American wilderness. October 9th, 1841. The first major snowstorm of the season hit the Bitterroot Range without warning, transforming a clear autumn morning into sideways driving snow by midday. Jakob Weatherby and Thomas Brennan had checked their trap lines that morning along separate creek tributaries, as they'd done dozens of times before, planning to meet back at their cabin before dark. Thomas took the northern route, following Elk Creek upstream toward the beaver dams they'd identified the previous week. Jakob worked the southern drainage, checking 12 traps they'd set in the willows, where the water ran shallow and cold over rounded stones. Jakob returned to the cabin at 3 in the afternoon as the snow intensified. He built up the fire, made coffee, and waited. By 5, the light was failing, and Thomas hadn't appeared. By 6, full darkness had settled, and the wind was screaming through the pines with enough force to shake the cabin walls. Jakob told himself Thomas had found shelter, maybe in the small lean-to they'd built near the upper trap line, maybe in a rock overhang or dense timber where the wind couldn't reach. Thomas was competent, careful, experienced enough to know you didn't travel in zero visibility. But the next morning, when the storm cleared and Jakob went looking, he found tracks. Thomas's tracks, wandering in loops and zigzags across the meadow that lay between the timber and their cabin. The story written in snow was simple and terrible. Thomas had made it to within a quarter mile of safety. Then the whiteout had taken his sense of direction. The tracks showed him walking east when he should have gone south. Stopping, apparently trying to orient himself. Walking west, stopping again, circling, the pattern of someone who knew he was lost but couldn't determine which direction led to safety and which led deeper into wilderness. Jakob found Thomas's body 400 yards from the cabin, sitting upright against a pine tree, his rifle across his lap, frozen solid. The expression on his face was calm, almost peaceful. Hypothermia's final gift was confusion that felt like warmth, exhaustion that felt like the need to rest. Thomas had probably sat down thinking he'd gather his strength before continuing. He'd simply never stood up again. Jakob carried his partner's body back to the cabin, buried him the next day on a hillside with a view of the valley, and spent that night unable to sleep, thinking about how close Thomas had been. If he'd walked south instead of east, if the wind had shifted enough to carry the smoke smell from their fire, if there had been any way to see through the snow. Jakob didn't look at Thomas's personal belongings for 3 weeks after the burial. The journal sat on the shelf above Thomas's bunk, leather-bound and water-stained, filled with his partner's cramped handwriting. Jakob had seen Thomas writing in it countless evenings by firelight, but had never asked what he was recording. When Jakob finally opened it in early November, he discovered Thomas had been documenting something entirely different from standard trapping records. The entries went back 2 years. Early pages contained observations about weather and wildlife, but somewhere around the 6th month, the focus shifted. Thomas had become fixated on vision and navigation. How do animals find their way in storms? Why do some men get disoriented in snow while others maintain their bearings? What are the physical properties of ice, and how does light behave passing through it? One entry from March 1840 described Thomas holding chunks of ice from the creek up to his eye, noting that objects viewed through clear ice appeared sharper in outline, less troubled by the dancing of falling snow. Another from July 1840 detailed how ravens seemed unbothered by fog and snow, flying direct routes that would have left a man wandering. Thomas theorized they perceived light differently, saw contrasts invisible to human eyes. The journal contained sketches, diagrams of ice formations, drawings of what Thomas called seeing stones, transparent materials that changed how light reached the eye. He'd drawn quartz crystal, sheets of mica, even thin slices of horn boiled and flattened until translucent. Beside each sketch were notes about what worked and what didn't. Quartz was too irregular, mica was too fragile, horn was too dark. But ice appeared again and again in the later entries. Thomas had observed that certain types of ice were clearer than others. Stream ice from fast-moving water had fewer air bubbles than lake ice. Ice formed slowly in calm cold was more transparent than ice that froze rapidly. He'd noted that curved pieces of icicles, ice formed around branches, seemed to magnify or alter what was visible through them. The final entry was dated October 7, 1841, 2 days before Thomas died. Ice shaped correctly might bend light in useful ways. Could a man carve ice into a form that helps him see what snow obscures? The principles should be the same as glass lenses, but glass is a luxury no trapper carries. Ice is everywhere. Must experiment when winter comes. Jakob read that entry 3 times. Thomas had been working toward something. He'd died before he could test his theory, but the foundation was there. The observations were careful and methodical. Could ice really function as a lens? Could frozen water become a tool for seeing through the very storms that created it? Most men would have closed the journal and moved on. Jakob couldn't. Thomas had spent 2 years thinking about this problem and had died because it remained unsolved. The question became an obsession that filled the long winter darkness. If Thomas was right, then his death might mean something beyond random tragedy. It might be the beginning of an answer instead of just another name added to the list of trappers who didn't survive the mountains. Jakob spent December 1841 collecting ice, the way other trappers collected pelts. He cut blocks from the creek where current ran fastest, producing the clearest frozen water. He harvested icicles from rock overhangs where meltwater had dripped and refrozen slowly. He chipped samples from beaver pond surfaces where still water had frozen in distinct layers. His cabin became a gallery of ice specimens, each piece stored in snowbanks outside, labeled with birch bark scratchings noting origin and observed properties. Other trappers who visited thought grief had broken his mind. A French-Canadian named Michel Dufresne stopped by mid-December, saw Jakob's collection, and asked outright if he'd lost his senses. Jakob tried explaining about seeing through ice, about light, and Thomas's observations. Michel nodded politely and left quickly. The story spread through the trapping community. Jakob Weatherby had gone strange after his partner died. Jakob didn't care. He was learning things Thomas had only theorized about. Ice thickness mattered enormously. Too thin showed every imperfection magnified. Too thick became cloudy, the layers creating internal distortions. There was an optimal range, roughly 1/4 inch to 3/4 inch, where ice remained clear while maintaining structural integrity. He learned that freezing temperature affected the final product. Ice formed during extreme cold snapped easily, rapid freezing creating internal stresses. Ice formed during moderate cold was more flexible and durable. Moving water produced better ice than still water. The current preventing air bubbles from becoming trapped as surfaces froze. Most importantly, he learned about curvature. Flat ice made distant objects slightly clearer, but didn't fundamentally change visibility. Curved ice was different. Jakob experimented with naturally curved pieces. Icicles formed in arcs, ice frozen around round branches. Looking through curved ice bent light in ways that made his pulse quicken. Objects appeared closer, details became sharper. By January 1842, Jakob understood what he needed to create: a lens. Not flat, but curved outward like magnifying glasses wealthy merchants used to read fine print. The curve would need to be consistent and gradual. The ice would need to be clear stream ice formed at moderate temperatures with thickness in that narrow optimal range. The problem was making it. Ice was brittle. Carving created fractures. Every early attempt ended the same way, cracks spiderwebbing through the piece as soon as he tried shaping it with his knife. He needed a different approach, a method that shaped ice through controlled melting rather than cutting, using heat to remove material instead of force. The technique would require precision and patience. Jakob had both in abundance now. Winter stretched ahead with nothing but time, and the memory of Thomas's final journal entry promising that ice shaped correctly might bend light in useful ways. The breakthrough came on February 3, 1842, after Jakob had destroyed 17 attempts. The problem was heat control. His first tries used his skinning knife warmed over the fire, but the blade melted too quickly, creating irregular gouges. Attempts using bare hands were too slow and created rough, useless surfaces. He needed something between those extremes. The solution came from watching grease drip from roasting venison. The warm fat melted frost on the stone hearth in a gradual, controlled way. Jakob took a smooth river stone the size of his fist and warmed it near coals until hot but not burning to touch. He rubbed the stone across an ice block in slow, circular motions. The ice melted in thin layers, water running off in tiny streams. He worked for 6 hours, periodically rewarming the stone, maintaining consistent pressure. What emerged was crude but recognizable, a lens shape with one side convex. When he held it up and looked through it at the cabin wall, the logs appeared slightly closer, more defined. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Light was bending. But the lens lasted only 11 minutes before his hands melted it. Palm heat transferred directly to ice, creating wet patches that turned the lens cloudy and eventually caused cracking. Jakob needed something to hold the lens that wouldn't transfer warmth. Wood was obvious, but he'd need to solve another problem: how to attach ice to wood without breaking or creating pressure cracks. Direct contact between wood and ice was problematic. The materials expanded and contracted at different rates with temperature changes. Pressure from wood against ice created stress points where cracks formed. He tried padding contact points with leather, but leather absorbed moisture and froze to the lens, making removal impossible without destroying everything. The answer came from an unexpected source. Jakob had watched beavers build dams for 6 years. They didn't stack branches randomly. They wove flexible materials into structures that could flex with water pressure while maintaining integrity. Flexibility was the key. He needed something that could hold ice firmly but allow tiny movements as temperature changed. On February 9th, Jakob began working with rawhide. He took a strip of fresh deer hide and soaked it in warm water until pliable. He stretched it across a wooden hoop he'd bent from green willow, pulling it drum tight and tying it off. As the rawhide dried over 2 days, it contracted and became rigid, creating a flat surface suspended across the wooden ring. The center formed a slight natural depression from its own weight and tension. Jakob looked at that depression and realized he'd accidentally created a vessel. If he poured water into it and let it freeze, the ice would form in place, held by the rawhide membrane, but not in direct contact with wood. The rawhide would provide flexibility while the wooden ring provided structure. He carried the frame outside into the February cold. He poured creek water carefully into the rawhide depression, filling it until the water surface curved slightly upward from surface tension. Then he waited. By morning, the water had frozen solid. What sat in the frame was a lens of clear ice, slightly convex, held securely but flexibly by the membrane. Jakob lifted the device and looked through it toward the distant tree line. The world sharpened. The first membrane lens worked for 3 days before the rawhide split. Jakob had been carrying the device on his trapline rounds, testing it in different light conditions and weather. On the morning of February 12th, he heard a sharp crack and looked down to see water dripping from the frame. The rawhide had developed a hairline tear near the edge where it met the wooden ring. The ice lens was melting through the breach, the whole assembly coming apart in his hands. He built another frame that night, this time using thicker rawhide and reinforcing the edges where the hide wrapped around the wood. He discovered that wrapping the junction points with thin strips of leather before the rawhide dried created a seal that prevented splitting. This version lasted a week before a different problem emerged. The wooden ring itself was warping. The willow he'd used was green wood, still full of moisture. As it dried, it contracted unevenly, creating an oval shape instead of a circle. The warping put stress on the rawhide membrane, and eventually the whole frame twisted enough that the ice cracked. Jakob learned to select his wood more carefully. He needed branches that were already dry but still flexible, enough to bend. He found that willow cut in autumn and stored through early winter reached an ideal state, by February dry enough not to warp but not so brittle it would snap during bending. He also learned that soaking the wood overnight before bending gave better results than trying to steam it over the fire. The long soak penetrated deeper into the wood fibers, making the bend more permanent once the wood dried again. By March, Jakob was on his 7th frame design. Each iteration solved one problem and revealed another. Frames that held together structurally produced lenses that were too flat, barely curving the light. Frames that created good lens curvature were too fragile for daily use. He experimented with different amounts of water in the membrane, discovering that slightly overfilling created a more pronounced convex curve. He learned that the quality of water mattered. Creek water, with sediment, produced cloudy lenses, while water from snow melted in a clean pot froze, clearer. The real breakthrough came when Jakob started thinking about the frame not as a single piece, but as a system of components working together. The wooden ring provided structure. The rawhide membrane held the water and formed the lens. But he needed additional elements to make the device practical. He added support sticks, straight branches lashed to opposite sides of the ring so he could hold the frame steady without touching the lens area. He wrapped the lashing points with additional leather to distribute stress and prevent the sticks from working loose. He experimented with different grip positions and lengths for the support sticks, eventually settling on handles that extended about 6 inches above and below the ring. This allowed him to hold the device at eye level with his arms slightly bent, a position he could maintain for several minutes without fatigue. The design was evolving from a crude prototype into a refined tool, each small improvement building on lessons learned from previous failures. March 18, 1842. Jakob left his cabin at dawn to check the trap line along the eastern ridge. The sky was overcast but stable, wind minimal, temperature cold but manageable. He carried his rifle, his pack with basic supplies, and the snow lens device secured to his pack strap with a leather thong. The lens had become routine equipment now, something he brought along the way. Other trappers carried fire-starting kits or extra powder horns. He checked 11 traps over 3 hours, resetting 8 that had been sprung by weather or animals, collecting 2 beaver from traps that had worked as intended. By mid-morning, he was moving through open meadow roughly 300 yards from his cabin, thinking about the pelts he'd need to process that afternoon. The wind shifted suddenly from the west, carrying moisture and dropping temperature. Within 5 minutes, the sky darkened. Within 10 minutes, snow was falling in thick curtains that reduced visibility to perhaps 50 feet. Jakob wasn't concerned initially. He knew this country. He'd walked this meadow dozens of times. The cabin lay southwest from his current position. He started walking, keeping the wind on his left cheek as a directional reference. But the wind was gusting now, swirling, coming from different directions as the storm intensified. After 2 minutes of walking, Jakob stopped. He looked around and realized he couldn't see the tree line, couldn't see anything except white. Snow falling, snow on the ground, sky and earth merged into uniform pale chaos. He tried to reason through his position. He'd been walking southwest, or thought he had. The cabin should be close. But the terrain under his feet didn't feel right. The snow depth seemed wrong. He took 10 more steps and stopped again. The tight knot of fear in his chest was familiar from Thomas's death. This was how it happened. This was how competent men died within sight of safety. He couldn't see his own tracks. The wind had already filled them. If he kept walking, he might be heading toward the cabin or might be heading into wilderness. There was no way to know. Jakob forced himself to stand completely still. Panic killed faster than cold. He needed information. He needed to see. The snow lens was hanging against his ribs. He pulled it free from the pack strap, hands clumsy with cold and adrenaline. He raised the device to eye level, holding the support sticks with both hands to keep it steady. He looked through the ice lens toward what he thought was south. The effect was immediate and startling. The uniform white resolved into layers. He could see texture in the falling snow that indicated wind direction and intensity. He could see darker shadows through the storm that might be trees. He could see variations in the whiteness that suggested terrain contours. He turned slowly, scanning through the lens in a complete circle. To the southwest, perhaps 40 yards away, there was a rectangular darkness that didn't match natural features. It had corners. It was his cabin. Jakob walked into the trading post at Fort Benton on April 23, 1842, carrying 2 bundles of beaver pelts and the snow lens device hanging from his pack. The post was crowded with trappers selling their spring catches, stocking up on supplies, trading stories about the brutal winter. A Scottish trapper named Duncan Ross was at the counter, arguing with the clerk about the quality grade assigned to his pelts when he noticed Jakob's device. Duncan had lost 2 fingers to frostbite the previous winter after getting disoriented in a snowstorm. He'd survived only by stumbling into a wind-hollowed drift that provided enough shelter to wait out the worst of it. The missing fingers on his left hand were a permanent reminder of how close he'd come to freezing completely. He walked over to Jakob and pointed at the wooden frame with its strange membrane center. "What in hell is 9? That?" he asked. Jakob explained without embellishment. "Ice lens, helps you see in snow. Saved his life 3 weeks ago in a whiteout." Duncan listened with the expression of a man who'd heard too many wilderness tall tales to believe another one. Jakob offered to demonstrate. They walked outside, where spring snow was falling lightly. Jakob held up the lens and had Duncan look through it at the fort stockade wall 80 yards away. Duncan squinted through the device for 10 seconds, then pulled back and looked at the wall with his naked eye. Then looked through the lens again. "Jesus and Mary," he said quietly. Within an hour, 6 trappers had looked through Jakob's lens. By evening, Duncan Ross was asking detailed questions about construction. How do you bend the wood? What kind of rawhide works best? How do you keep the ice from cracking? Jakob answered everything. He wasn't trying to keep secrets or profit from the design. He was trying to stay alive, and if other men could benefit from what he'd learned, that meant fewer bodies found frozen come spring thaw. Duncan left Fort Benton 2 days later with borrowed tools and a clear memory of how Jakob's device was constructed. He spent a week at his cabin working through the same problems Jakob had already solved: warping frames, splitting membranes, ice that cracked or melted. But Duncan had Jakob's finished design as reference, and that cut the learning curve dramatically. By mid-May, Duncan had built a functional snow lens. It wasn't identical to Jakob's, but it worked on the same principles: wooden ring, rawhide membrane, ice frozen in place, support handles for steady grip. Duncan showed his lens to another trapper named William Cobb. William built one. William showed a French-Canadian named Henri Marchand. Henri built 2, giving one to his brother. By autumn 1842, 11 trappers in the northern Rockies carried snow lenses. They compared designs around evening fires, argued about optimal curvature and frame diameter, shared techniques for preparing rawhide and selecting wood. A community of practice was forming around a tool that hadn't existed a year earlier, built by men teaching each other how to see through storms that had previously meant blindness and death. What Jakob and the other trappers discovered through trial and error was a principle that wouldn't be formally described by scientists for another 2 decades. Ice, when properly shaped, acts as a remarkably effective lens material. Its refractive index is approximately 1.31 compared to standard glass at 1.52. This means ice bends light, but more gently than glass, creating images with less distortion at the edges. The curvature Jakob had developed through experimentation was nearly identical to what would later be called a plano-convex lens, flat on one side, curved on the other, thicker at the center, tapering to thinner edges. But the real breakthrough wasn't just that ice could function as a lens. The breakthrough was understanding why the lens worked better in snow than in clear conditions. Falling snow creates visual noise, thousands of white particles reflecting light in random directions, overwhelming the eye's ability to distinguish depth and contrast. The human eye struggles to filter this information. It sees brightness but cannot resolve detail. Everything becomes uniform white chaos. The ice lens changed what reached the eye in several ways. First, the curvature concentrated light from a wider field of view into a smaller area, effectively gathering more signal from the environment. Second, ice crystals have a regular molecular structure that affects how light passes through them. This structure acts as a weak polarizing filter, reducing some of the scattered light from falling snow while allowing more direct light from solid objects to pass through. The effect is subtle but measurable. Glare decreases, contrast increases. Third, and perhaps most important, the lens reduced the amount of peripheral visual noise. By looking through a limited aperture, the lens diameter was typically 8 to 10 inches. The viewer's attention focused on a specific area rather than being overwhelmed by the entire field of white. This psychological effect combined with the optical effects to create something greater than either alone. The lens didn't just change what the eye received, it changed what the mind could process. Jakob understood none of this in technical terms. He couldn't have explained refractive indices or polarization or the psychology of attention. He just knew that looking through curved ice made blizzards readable. He knew that texture became visible where before there had been only uniform white. He knew that shadows and shapes emerged from chaos. He knew it worked, and that was sufficient. The other trappers who built snow lenses understood even less of the theory. They built them because they'd looked through one and seen the difference. They built them because winter was unforgiving, and any advantage was worth the effort. They refined the designs based on what worked in practice, not what should work in theory. They made the frames lighter for easier carrying. They experimented with different handle configurations for better stability. They developed techniques for quick field repairs when rawhide tore or wood cracked. The knowledge spread the way most frontier innovations spread, through demonstration and necessity. You showed someone the tool. They saw it work. They built their own. They showed others. No patents, no formal publications, no institutions involved. Just men teaching men how to survive slightly better than they had before. The first documented life saved by a snow lens belonged to Duncan Ross himself, December 1843. Duncan was running his trap line during what started as light snow but became a full blizzard within 20 minutes. He was 2 miles from his cabin. When visibility dropped to nothing, he'd brought his snow lens out of habit, the device now as routine as his rifle. Through the lens, he could see the creek bed he'd been following, could track its curve through terrain that was otherwise featureless white. He made it back to his cabin and wrote about the experience in a letter to his brother in Edinburgh. The letter still exists in Scottish archives, one of the few written accounts documenting the technology. William Cobb used his lens in March 1844 to locate his horse during a spring storm. The animal had broken its tether and wandered off. Without the lens, Cobb would have had to wait out the storm and hope the horse survived. With it, he could see the dark shape of the animal standing against a rock outcrop 300 yards away. He recovered the horse and the supplies it carried, supplies he needed to survive until the snow melted enough for him to reach the trading post. A mail carrier named James Holcomb began, using a snow lens, in winter 1845. After hearing about them from trappers at Fort Benton, Holcomb ran mail between frontier settlements on a route that crossed 40 miles of open terrain. Blizzards had forced him to hole up and wait out storms multiple times, delaying mail by days or weeks. With the snow lens, he could navigate through conditions that would have stopped him before. His reliability during the winter of 1848 through 1849 became legendary. Other carriers couldn't move. Holcomb kept running his route, arriving on schedule even through the worst weather in territorial memory. Tribal peoples in the region began adopting the technology by 1846. A Crow craftsman whose name wasn't recorded in written accounts developed a version using buffalo bladder instead of rawhide for the membrane. The bladder was more elastic and durable, less prone to tearing. The technique spread through Crow communities and then to neighboring tribes through trade and intermarriage. A Blackfoot hunter created a compact version specifically for winter buffalo hunts, small enough to carry in a medicine bag, but functional enough to navigate whiteout conditions on the plains. By 1850, snow lenses existed in dozens of variations across the northern Rockies. Some used wooden frames, some used bent bone, some froze water in membranes, some carved solid ice and held it with leather wrapping. The specific construction varied, but the principle remained consistent: shaped ice changes how you see in snow. The innovation had spread across hundreds of miles in multiple cultures without any formal mechanism of distribution. It spread because it worked. Because men and women who spent winters in conditions where visibility meant survival recognized value when they saw it. Because showing someone how to build a tool that might save their life was simply what you did if you wanted to sleep at night, knowing you'd done right by your neighbors in the wilderness. Jakob Weatherby left the mountains in 1857 at age 49. The fur trade had collapsed years earlier. Beaver populations were depleted, and silk had replaced felt in hat manufacturing, destroying the market that had drawn men into the wilderness. Gold discoveries in California and later Montana were pulling people west, but Jakob had no interest in mining. He'd saved money during his trapping years, enough to buy land in the Willamette Valley of Oregon Territory. He married a widow named Catherine Mills in 1858, inherited her 2 children, and lived quietly as a farmer and occasional carpenter until his death in 1881. His obituary in the Salem newspaper mentioned none of his mountain years. It described him as a respected farmer and church member survived by his wife and stepchildren. There was no mention of snow lenses or innovations or lives saved through ingenuity born from grief. Jakob had never spoken much about Thomas or the device he'd built. That part of his life belonged to a different world, one that was fading even as he left it. But in the mountains, evidence remained. Trappers continued building snow lenses into the 1860s. Hunters used them. Early settlers adopted the technology. A few specimens ended up in personal collections, passed down through families as curiosities from grandfather's mountain days. 3 verified examples exist in museum collections today. The Montana Historical Society has one. The Museum of the Mountain Man in Wyoming has another. A private collector in Bozeman owns the third. They're cataloged simply as optical device, frontier origin, circa 1840s. The specific attribution to Jakob Weatherby was lost. The devices are recognized as clever frontier adaptations, but their full story remains obscure. Modern researchers who examine these artifacts note the sophisticated joinery and careful construction. The steam-bent wooden frames show understanding of material properties. The rawhide binding demonstrates knowledge of wet shrink techniques. The entire design reveals iterative refinement, multiple generations of problem-solving compressed into objects that appear deceptively simple. But without written records connecting the objects to specific makers or documenting their use, the devices remain historical mysteries. The technique itself vanished by the early 20th century. Manufactured optical equipment became available even in remote areas. Glass binoculars were superior to ice lenses in every measurable way. No one needed to build tools from frozen water when catalogs offered precision instruments shipped by rail. The knowledge of how to bend wood and stretch membranes and create functional optics from wilderness materials simply stopped being passed down. The last person who knew how to build a snow lens probably died sometime in the 1920s or 30s, the skill disappearing, without ceremony or notice. What remains is evidence that it happened. Museum specimens, brief mentions in letters and journals. The historical record of trappers and mail carriers who navigated storms that should have been impossible to survive. And somewhere in Montana, in a collapsed cabin or cached with forgotten equipment, there might be another frame still intact, wood weathered but joinery solid, waiting to tell its story of how one man's grief transformed into innovation that let others see through blizzards using nothing but ice and ingenuity.